The Harrow Wood, a story of what lives in the green, and the dark Part 1. The Survey Team Chapter 1. Arrival. The road that led to Harrow Wood was not on any of the maps that Joel Carn had printed at the office before the drive up. It appeared suddenly on the left side of a county highway, somewhere between the town of Aldenmore and a feed depot that had been shuttered for longer than anyone in the area cared to estimate. The road was unpaved, barely wider than a single vehicle, and it ran between two walls of tall grass that leaned inward from either side, as though the land itself were trying to close the gap and seal the entrance behind whatever had last passed through. Joel pulled the survey company's white truck to a stop at the mouth of the road and looked at it for a moment before reaching for the folder on the passenger seat. Inside the folder were the project documents, the topographic printouts, the client brief, and a satellite image of the target area that had been captured some months ago. According to the satellite image, the road ran for approximately 2.4 miles through open pasture before reaching the tree line. What lay beyond the tree line on the satellite image was a dense and unbroken canopy of forest stretching for 7 miles in every direction, interrupted only by a single clearing near the center that appeared on the image as a rough oval of lighter color. Perhaps a meadow, perhaps a pond. It was difficult to say from above. The job was a timber survey. Joel's company had been contracted by a land management firm based 3 counties over to assess the harvestable timber in a section of old-growth forest referred to in the project documents simply as the Harrow Wood parcel. The assessment required a team to walk the forest on foot, take core samples from representative trees, document species composition, estimate volume per acre, and GPS map the internal topography. It was the kind of job Joel's team did 4 or 5 times a year. It was not glamorous work, but it was systematic and satisfying in the way that all systematic work is satisfying, the steady accumulation of data that answers a question precisely and completely. He had done dozens of these. He had walked into more forests than he could count. He was not the sort of man who spooked easily in wild places. He turned down the unpaved road and drove toward the tree line. The team was 6 people, including Joel. There was Priya Sandhu, his deputy surveyor, who had been with the company for 4 years, and who was meticulous in a way that sometimes drove Joel slightly mad, and that he had come to depend on completely. There was Danny Weir, who handled the GPS equipment and the core sampling drill, and who had the particular combination of physical strength and mechanical patience that both tasks required. There was Claire Osborne, the botanist who documented species on any job where old-growth timber was involved, because old-growth parcels frequently contained protected species that complicated harvesting plans and had to be identified early. There was Marcus Tull, the company's photographer and drone operator, who documented everything visually for the client report. And there was a young man named Owen Briggs, who was on his 2nd field survey and who still had the alert, wide-eyed quality of someone for whom all of this was new enough to be genuinely exciting. They parked the truck and the 2nd vehicle at the edge of the tree line, where the unpaved road ended at a rusted metal gate that was padlocked but which the client had provided a key for. Joel unlocked the gate, swung it open, and stood for a moment at the threshold of the forest looking in. The Harrow Wood was old. He could tell that from the first moment he stood at its edge. He had been in old forests before, and they had a particular quality that younger forests did not. A quality of depth and density that was not only physical but atmospheric. The trees in front of him were enormous, their trunks wider than the span of a man's outstretched arms, their bark deeply furrowed and gray. their canopies so high and so thickly interlocked that only thin blades of morning light came through. The undergrowth between the trunks was low and sparse in the manner of old-growth forest floors, where the upper canopy claimed most of the available light and left little for the ground layer. The soil was covered in a deep carpet of moss that absorbed sound. Even standing at the edge with the open pasture behind him and the sound of birds in the grass at his back, Joel noticed that the forest in front of him was almost completely silent. Not the ordinary silence of a forest at rest, something more concentrated than that. Something that had the quality of a room that has been empty for a very long time. Owen came to stand beside him and looked in with the expression of someone seeing something large for the first time. "Big trees," Owen said. "Yes," Joel said. "Big trees." He led the team in. Chapter 2. The first day went without incident. The work was good. The trees were exceptional, the kind of old-growth specimens that timber clients loved precisely because the volume per tree was so high, each one representing hundreds of years of growth laid down in rings of dense, close-grained wood. Claire moved among them with her camera and her notebook, cataloging species. Noting the presence of a lichen she said she had not seen outside of old records for this part of the country. Danny drilled core samples at measured intervals. Priya logged coordinates and cross-checked everything against the topographic printouts. Marcus launched the drone twice during the morning to capture canopy footage, but both times the drone drifted erratically within 2 or 3 minutes of entering the forest airspace, losing signal from the controller, and he had to bring it back to the tree line to regain contact. He blamed interference from the canopy density and the terrain, which was plausible, and Joel noted it without particular concern. They ate lunch in a small clearing that appeared naturally where a giant tree had fallen some years ago, leaving a gap in the canopy that admitted a broad column of midday light. The fallen tree lay massive and moss-covered nearby, already decomposing, its interior colonized by ferns and fungi. They sat on the trunk and ate the sandwiches they had packed and talked about the job and about other jobs and about ordinary things. The atmosphere was easy. After lunch, the work should have felt easier, but the mood of the forest shifted in a way none of them could date exactly. The air seemed heavier under the trees. Their own noises still carried, boots in moss, the drone motor, Marcus clearing his throat, yet everything else was strangely muted. Even the breeze sounded far away, as if the wood were swallowing sound before it could travel. Priya was the first to say it. The birds had stopped. Joel listened and realized she was right. No chatter in the branches. No sudden wings, no squirrels scraping bark. It was not peaceful quiet. It was the kind of silence that makes people lower their voices without knowing why. Near the edge of the clearing, Danny found 4 long pale grooves cut into a cedar trunk, beginning too high for any easy explanation. No one called them claw marks, but after that they all began looking up more often than before. Joel noticed, during the lunch break, that the forest was very quiet. Not silent the way it had seemed at the entrance, exactly, but quiet in a way that he found himself monitoring without entirely meaning to. There were some birds, the occasional sound of wind in the high canopy, but there were no small animals audible in the undergrowth, no rustle of squirrels or mice or voles, none of the constant low-level movement that a healthy forest floor usually produced. He mentioned it to Priya, who had also noticed, and who said that old-growth forests sometimes had altered acoustic profiles due to the depth of the moss layer and the absence of a dense shrub layer, which was true. Joel accepted this explanation and they went back to work. They completed their planned survey transect for the first day and hiked back out to the vehicles in the late afternoon. The light was still good when they emerged from the trees. They drove to the motel in Aldenmore, had dinner at the diner attached to it, and went to their respective rooms. Joel lay in his motel bed that night and stared at the ceiling, and tried to identify why he felt the particular low-grade unease that had been sitting in the back of his chest since they had walked out of the forest that evening. He turned the day over in his mind, examining each piece of it, and found nothing that he could point to and say, "There, that is the thing that is wrong." Everything had been normal. The work had gone well. The team had been professional and in good spirits. He fell asleep eventually, and if he dreamed, he did not remember the dreams in the morning. Chapter 3. Owen Briggs disappeared on the morning of the second day. They had entered the forest at 8:15 and split into 2 working pairs according to the plan. Joel had laid out the evening before, with Joel and Owen taking the northern transect and Priya, and Danny taking the southern one, while Claire worked independently on species documentation between them, and Marcus handled photography and drone attempts along both routes. They had radios. They had agreed to check in every 30 minutes and to meet at the central clearing that appeared on the satellite image, which the topographic data placed at approximately 2 miles in from the entry point, at noon. Owen was walking 6 or 8 feet behind Joel along the northern transect when Joel stopped to check the GPS unit and make a note on the data tablet. This took perhaps 90 seconds. When Joel looked up from the tablet and turned to confirm their bearing with Owen, Owen was not there. Joel stood still for a moment and looked in every direction. The forest around him was the forest it always was: enormous gray trunks, deep moss, thin blades of light from far above, silence. "Owen," he said. His voice went out into the trees and came back to him in a way that felt wrong, not an echo exactly. Just the particular deadened quality of sound in a space that absorbs it rather than reflecting it. The moss and the canopy and the deep layers of soil beneath taking the shape of his voice and pulling it apart. He called again, louder. He got on the radio and called Owen's name. He walked back 20 yards along the transect line, following his own boot prints in the moss, looking to both sides. He covered the ground in a methodical grid, moving out 30 feet from the transect in both directions, calling Owen's name at intervals. He found nothing. No sign of where Owen had gone. No answering call. He radioed Priya and told her what had happened, keeping his voice measured and factual. He told her to stay on the southern transect with Danny and to keep checking in. He told Marcus, who was operating between them, to move toward the northern transect. Then he spent another 40 minutes searching the immediate area before he acknowledged, with the cold clarity of a man who does not allow himself to panic, but who recognizes the facts of a situation when they present themselves, that Owen was gone, not lost. The word that came to Joel was not lost. A person who is lost is somewhere in the vicinity of where they were last seen, disoriented, trying to find their way. What the forest around Joel communicated to him, in its absolute unresponsive silence, was something more final than that. Owen had been 6 feet behind him. Owen had made no sound. Owen had left no visible track leading away from the transect line. In 90 seconds, in broad daylight, in a forest with no features that offered concealment at ground level, Owen Briggs had simply ceased to be present. Joel walked toward the central clearing and called a team meeting on the radio. Chapter 4. The sound in the canopy. The team assembled at the edge of the central clearing, which turned out to be a meadow, roughly circular, perhaps 60 feet across, carpeted in pale yellowed grass that was different from any grass Joel had seen in the forest surroundings. The grass was dead or dormant. He could not tell which. It lay flat against the soil in a uniform way, not blown by wind since there was no wind, simply pressed down as though something had passed over it recently and at considerable weight. Joel told the team about Owen. He told them what had happened, when it had happened, where it had happened, in the same steady and precise voice he used for client briefings. He watched their faces as he spoke. He watched Priya's expression close down into the particular focused concentration she used when she was suppressing an emotional response in favor of a practical one. He watched Danny's jaw set. He watched Claire put one hand against the nearest tree trunk, as though she needed something solid to hold on to. He watched Marcus lower the camera he had been holding and study the ground for a moment. "We searched together," Joel said. "Full team, no one more than arm's length from the next person. We cover the area around the northern transect systematically. They spent 2 hours searching. They found nothing. No sign of Owen's passage through the undergrowth. No dropped equipment, no footprints leading anywhere other than directly back along the transect line in the direction they had come from. No response to their calls, which they made at regular intervals, and which the forest received and dismantled in its characteristic silent way. As the search spread wider, smaller things became wrong in ways Joel could not explain. Voices traveled badly. A call made 20 yards away sounded distant, while a footstep somewhere behind him sometimes seemed to land at his shoulder. Once Claire stopped dead and asked who had whispered her name. No one had. The silence that followed that question unsettled everyone more than a shouted warning could have done. They found hints without answers. Moss had been brushed flat in long, curved swaths. One sapling was bent almost double without breaking. Fresh splintering showed high above them where heavy branches had been disturbed. When Marcus called Owen's name again, the echo came back wrong. Not louder, not clearer, just altered, as if something in the trees had tried to say it too late and almost got it right. It was during this search that Joel first heard the sound from the canopy. He was standing still for a moment, marking a position on the GPS, when he heard it from somewhere above. It was difficult to describe. It was not any sound that the trees themselves made, the creak of wood or the sigh of wind through leaves. It was lower than that and more purposeful, a slow, rhythmic sound that began and stopped and began again, like something very large shifting its weight from one position to another among the upper branches, far above the level where any bird or animal of ordinary size would be found. He looked up. At first he saw only branch, shadow, and wet needles. Then the canopy rearranged itself around a shape that had been hidden so well it felt impossible to trust his own sight. Several high limbs were bowed downward under a distributed weight far too great for any ordinary animal. Between trunk and branch, he found something pale and long, folded so close to the wood that it almost passed for part of the tree. The proportions were wrong. It seemed too thin in one instant and impossibly powerful in the next. One arm, if it was an arm, uncurled with slow precision and gripped the branch with fingers that looked far too long. Then came the sound beneath the sound, a faint clicking, intimate and irregular, like joints easing into place after being still for too long. Joel understood with sickening certainty that whatever it was had been keeping pace with them for some time. The canopy was 100 feet above him, a mosaic of gray branches and deep green, and the light that filtered through it was diffuse and directionless in the way of overcast sky, which was strange because the morning had been clear and sunny. He stared upward for a long time, tracking the sound, trying to identify its source. He saw nothing. The canopy was still, The sound stopped. He stood there for another minute with his head tilted back, watching the canopy. Then he put the GPS in his vest pocket and called the team together to move to the next search grid. He did not mention the sound to the others. He told himself this was because he had not identified it clearly enough to make it worth mentioning. He was not sure this was the real reason. Chapter 5. Claire Osborne disappeared at 2:30 in the afternoon. The team was moving together, as Joel had directed, and had been doing so since the morning's events. They were working their way back toward the northern transect to complete one final sweep before Joel made the decision he had been postponing for 2 hours, the decision to leave the forest and call the authorities. He had been postponing it because he was still, in some portion of himself, maintaining the possibility that Owen had simply become disoriented and wandered in a direction none of them had yet searched, and that calling the authorities felt like the closing of a door he was not yet ready to close. Claire was beside Marcus, 4 feet to Joel's right. Priya was on his left. Danny was directly behind him. Joel heard a soft sound. He turned to his right. Claire and Marcus were standing still. Claire was facing away from the group, looking into the trees to the east. She was standing very straight, her head slightly tilted, in the posture of someone listening to something at the edge of audibility. "Claire," Priya said. Claire turned her head very slowly and looked back at them over her shoulder. Her expression was one that Joel could not immediately classify. Not fear, not distress, something more neutral than either, the expression of someone receiving information. "Can you hear that?" Claire said. Her voice was quiet and perfectly calm. Joel took a step toward her. "What?" he said. Claire turned back toward the trees. She took one step in that direction and then another. Joel crossed the 4 feet between them in 2 strides and put his hand on her shoulder. The contact seemed to bring her back to herself in some way, because she startled and looked at him with momentary confusion, the way a person looks when they have been deep in thought and are suddenly recalled to the physical world. "There is a sound," she said, "from that direction. Can you hear it?" Joel listened. He heard the forest. He heard the silence that was the forest's particular version of sound. And beneath it or behind it or woven into it in a way that made it difficult to separate from the ambient silence itself, he heard something. A low and rhythmic sound, patient, unhurried. The same sound he had heard from the canopy that morning, except that now it was not above him but ahead, somewhere between the tree trunks to the east at ground level. "Yes," he said, "I hear it." He did not let go of Claire's shoulder. He radioed for the rest of the team to close in. He was watching the trees to the east with the alert and careful attention of a man who has decided not to look away. There was nothing visible between the trunks. The light was the same diffuse gray it had been all afternoon. The moss was the same unbroken carpet. The shadows between the trees were deep, but not impenetrable, and as far back as Joel could see into the forest in that direction, which was perhaps 100 yards before the density of the trunks reduced visibility to nothing, there was nothing there. The sound stopped. Danny arrived at Joel's side. Priya arrived a moment later from the other direction. Marcus was already there. "Where is Claire?" Priya asked. Joel looked to his right. He was still holding Claire's shoulder. His hand was still raised, still in the position it had been in, curved slightly at the fingers in the exact shape of a shoulder it was no longer resting on. She was gone. He had not heard a sound. He had not felt her move away. He had not taken his eyes off the trees for more than the single second it took him to look back at Priya. In that single second, in broad daylight, with his hand on her shoulder and 3 other people within 10 feet, Claire Osborne had ceased to be present. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Marcus took a step backward. "We need to leave," Marcus said. "We need to leave right now." Joel did not argue with him. Chapter 6. The walk out. The four of them moved toward the tree line at a pace that was just below a run, fast enough that the pace communicated urgency without abandoning the coordination they needed to stay together. Joel had the compass bearing to the entry gate memorized, and he navigated by it, checking it every 40 seconds, correcting their line. Priya was on his left, Danny on his right, Marcus directly behind him, and Joel had instructed them to maintain physical contact, to keep a hand on the shoulder of the person in front of them. And they did this with a wordless and total compliance that told him something about the state they were all in. They did not speak during the walk. There was nothing to say that would improve the situation, and speaking required attention that Joel wanted directed entirely at the forest around them and the compass bearing in his hand. The forest watched them go. He felt it watching. He was not a man given to metaphor, and he would not have used that word in a client report or a professional conversation, but it was the only word that fit the quality of attention he felt emanating from the trees around them as they moved. Not the passive presence of a wild place, something active, something that registered their movement and their direction, and the number of them, and the pace they were moving at. He felt it the way you feel the attention of another person in a room even before you have seen them, a pressure at the periphery of awareness, a subtle shift in the weight of the surrounding air. He did not look up at the canopy. Not looking became its own kind of pain. Bark dust drifted down once and touched the back of his hand. A branch above them flexed under a weight that should have snapped it. Then they heard what sounded like footsteps behind them, light and quick and human enough to make Danny almost turn. A second later, the same pattern crossed overhead from left to right. No one spoke for several seconds after that. Fear had become too plain between them for anyone to pretend anymore. He was almost certain that if he looked up at the canopy, he would see something, and he did not want to see it. Not yet. Not while he was responsible for getting 3 people out of this forest, because he suspected that seeing it would do something to him that he could not easily undo. They were perhaps 3/4 of a mile from the tree line when Danny stopped. Danny stopped so suddenly that Marcus walked into his back, and Priya took 2 extra steps before she caught herself. Joel turned around. Danny was standing still, facing back the way they had come, his GPS unit hanging from his right hand. His face was the particular color and texture of a man who has received a shock so significant that his body has temporarily diverted blood from the surface to the interior, pale and slightly damp, and very still. "Danny," Joel said. Danny did not respond. Joel took 2 steps back toward him and put both hands on Danny's arms and said his name again, sharply, in the tone he used in emergencies. Danny blinked. He looked at Joel. His eyes were present, but the expression behind them was the expression of someone who has seen something that their mind has not yet finished processing. "Keep moving," Joel said. "Look at me. Keep moving." Danny looked at him for another moment and then nodded once, a small mechanical movement, and turned back toward the tree line and kept walking. Joel asked him nothing. He kept them moving. They were 200 yards from the gate when Marcus disappeared. Joel heard the sound this time. He heard it behind him, which was where Marcus was, and it was not a human sound. It was not a struggle or a fall or a cry. It was a sound that Joel's mind, in the fraction of a second it had to process it, classified as a movement of air, large and sudden, like the displacement produced by something very large moving very fast through a space that was too small for it. A single breath of displaced air, a soft concussion against the eardrums, and then nothing. He turned around. Marcus was gone. Joel turned back to Priya and Danny. He looked at them. They looked at him. All three of them were breathing hard. "Run," Joel said. They ran. They ran without shape or dignity, crashing through brush they had carefully stepped around on the way in. The forest now seemed arranged to slow them. Roots rose where their feet landed. Wet branches caught sleeves and packs. Above them, something heavier moved at their pace. Not stumbling, not hurrying, simply tracking. Twice Joel heard Danny trip hard enough that he expected the sound of pursuit to replace the sound of Danny's feet, but each time the footsteps returned, ragged and desperate. Something struck a trunk to Joel's left with such force that the whole stand of trees shivered. He saw bark spray outward and branches whip violently high above. Behind him, Priya made one short, shocked sound and then bit it off. The gate appeared through the trees first as a shape and then as salvation. They burst from the tree line with the terrible feeling that whatever had followed them had stopped only because it had chosen to stop there. Chapter 7. The gate. They came through the tree line at a full sprint and crossed the open pasture without slowing, the dry grass whipping against their legs. The gate visible ahead of them with the two parked vehicles beyond it gleaming in the afternoon sun. Joel hit the gate at speed and went over it without looking for the key, and landed on the other side and turned to make sure Priya and Danny were through. They were. All three of them stood on the other side of the gate in the open afternoon sunlight, breathing in the gasping, irregular way of people who have been running in fear rather than for exercise, their hands on their knees, their chests heaving. The pasture was ordinary. The sky was blue. The distant sound of a tractor somewhere over the hill was the most reassuring sound Joel had ever heard in his life. He straightened up and looked back at the tree line. The forest stood exactly as it always stood, dense, silent. The gate in front of it hanging slightly open from where they had come through. The gap in the trees that marked the entrance to the forest interior perfectly dark, perfectly still, perfectly unrevealing. He stood there for a full minute looking at it. He was aware of Priya beside him and Danny on his other side. None of them spoke. Then Joel turned away from the trees and walked to his truck and got in and sat behind the wheel with his hands in his lap and stared through the windscreen at the pasture grass and the blue afternoon sky beyond it. He picked up his phone. He called the emergency line. He said, in the measured and precise voice that was his professional voice, that 3 members of his survey team had disappeared inside a forest called the Harrow Wood parcel in Aldenmore County, that the disappearances had occurred in daylight in a period of approximately 6 hours, and that he required search and rescue assistance immediately. The dispatcher asked him to stay on the line. He stayed on the line. He did not look back at the forest. Part 2. What remained. Chapter 8. The search and rescue team arrived within the hour and entered the forest. They found nothing. No trace of Owen Briggs, no trace of Claire Osborne, no trace of Marcus Tull. The search teams operated in pairs with radios and were instructed to maintain voice contact at all times. And they did this. And they emerged from the forest at the end of the day without having found so much as a footprint that did not belong to one of the searchers themselves. Joel gave a full account to the sheriff's department that evening, sitting in the back of an ambulance that had been summoned as a precaution, wrapped in a silver thermal blanket that he did not need. He gave the account in the same precise and sequential way he would have given a project debrief, noting the time of each disappearance, the position, the circumstances, what he had seen and heard and what he had not seen and not heard. He did not editorialize. He did not speculate. He answered the investigators' questions accurately and completely. The investigators' questions were the questions of people who were looking for rational explanations within a framework that did not yet have room for what Joel was describing. Their questions implied that Owen had wandered away and become lost, and that Claire had done the same, and that Marcus had panicked and run in the wrong direction. Their questions were not unreasonable questions. They were the questions that a reasonable person would ask given reasonable experience of how the world worked. Joel answered them. He did not argue with the framework. Priya was interviewed separately. She gave a consistent account. Danny was interviewed and gave a shorter account, not from dishonesty, but because Danny had reached some internal boundary during the events of the day that he had not yet fully processed. And the processing was ongoing and was taking the form of long silences and short, careful answers. The search continued for 4 days. Additional teams were brought in. Canine units were used, but the dogs behaved strangely at the tree line, refusing to enter, pressing back against their handlers in a way that the handlers described with visible discomfort, as unlike anything they had seen from trained search dogs. None of the missing were found. The case was classified as a missing persons investigation, and it remained open, and nothing further occurred in the weeks immediately following, and the Harrow Wood sat at the end of its unpaved road as it had always sat, behind its rusted gate at the edge of its empty pasture. Chapter 9. Joel. Weeks later, Joel Karn was not sleeping. This was not the ordinary insomnia of a troubled mind. He could fall asleep. Sleep came for him every night reliably and quickly, which was itself part of the problem, because the sleep that came for him was deep and strange and full of the forest. And he emerged from it each morning not rested but altered, as though something had been at work on him during the hours he was unconscious that had its own agenda and its own schedule, and was proceeding with both regardless of what Joel wanted. He dreamed of the canopy. He dreamed of the moss and the silence and the enormous gray trunks receding in every direction. He dreamed of looking up through the interlocking branches at a sky that was wrong in a way he could not specify. A sky that was the right color and the right texture, but that was somehow not the sky above Aldenmore County or any other county he had ever worked in. A sky that was further away than skies were supposed to be. He dreamed of a sound, the same sound he had heard in the forest, low and rhythmic and patient, and in the dreams it was closer than it had been in the forest. In the dreams it was very close. He went to a therapist. He answered the therapist's questions accurately. The therapist used the word trauma in a professional and compassionate way, and Joel sat with the word and tried to decide whether it fit. He thought it probably fit. He also thought that it did not entirely cover the situation. He thought about Owen, who had been 26 years old and had still had the quality of someone for whom everything was new. He thought about Claire and her notebook full of species data that was still in the forest somewhere, in whatever corner of the forest the search teams had not reached. He thought about Marcus and the camera hanging from his hand and the single sound of displaced air. He thought about what he had not looked at, what he had chosen not to look at in the canopy and in the upper branches and in the spaces between the trees. He thought about that choice and whether it had been wisdom or cowardice, and he arrived, most nights, at the same conclusion, that it had been both, and that the distinction was largely irrelevant because the choice had preserved his ability to function, and that ability had been necessary for getting Priya and Danny out of the forest. And so the choice had been, in the only measurement that practically mattered, the correct one. But he also knew that not looking did not mean it was not there. He knew what had been in the trees. He had not seen it. He had heard it and felt it, and understood it with the deep animal portion of his nervous system that operated below the level of language and reason. And that portion of him had known from the first moment he crossed the tree line on the first day exactly what the Harrow Wood contained and exactly what it was doing with the silence and the stillness, and the particular patience of something that has been in one place for a very long time, and is in no hurry, because it has nowhere else to be. He had known. He had gone in anyway. That was the thing he lived with. Chapter 10. The call from the sheriff's department came on a Tuesday morning in the 4th week after the survey. The detective on the case, a methodical woman named Hargrove who had been one of the investigators on the night of the disappearances and who had treated Joel's account with more careful attention than the others had, asked him if he would be willing to consult on a re-entry operation. She said the department was putting together a team of 10 officers, all experienced in wilderness operations, all equipped with body cameras and communication gear, and that she wanted someone with knowledge of the forest's interior topography to guide the team. Joel sat with the phone against his ear and looked at the wall of his home office and said nothing for a moment. The detective said, "I understand if you decline." Joel said, "When do you go in?" The detective said, "Saturday morning, first light." Joel said, "I will be there." He sat at his desk for a long time after he put the phone down. He looked at the topographic printouts that were still spread across the corner of the desk, where he had left them 4 weeks ago. He looked at the satellite image with its unbroken green canopy and its oval clearing at the center. He looked at these things for a long time. Then he went to his bedroom and opened the closet and found the boots he had been wearing in the forest, which he had put in a plastic bag when he got home and sealed and placed on the highest shelf with some intention of either throwing them away or dealing with them later. He had not thrown them away. He took the bag down and opened it and looked at the boots. The soles were caked with the dark, fine-grained soil of the forest floor and with fragments of the pale gray-green moss. He stood holding the bag and looking at the boots for a long time, the same way he had looked at the topographic printouts, with the focused and patient attention of someone trying to read something that is not quite written in language. He put the bag back on the shelf. He would wear different boots on Saturday. He went back to his desk and began to prepare. Part 3, the second entry, Chapter 11. Saturday morning, the county had dispatched 10 officers. They assembled at the gate at 6 in the morning, the sun barely above the horizon, the pasture grass silver with dew. Joel was there when they arrived, sitting on the hood of his truck in his jacket with a coffee cup in his hand, and he watched them unload their equipment with the eyes of a man taking inventory. They were well equipped, body cameras on their vests, activated and recording, radios on separate channels, GPS units, survival packs. The lead officer, a sergeant named Barlow, was a solid and calm man in his late 40s who had done wilderness operations and had the particular physical ease of someone who was genuinely comfortable in difficult terrain. He introduced his team to Joel in the gray early morning light, and Joel shook each hand and noted each face. They were 10, Sergeant Barlow. Officers Vance, Corrigan, Maida, Davies, Ellsworth, Park, Tran, Holloway, and Reyes. They ranged in age from what looked like late 20s to early 50s. They were serious and focused and properly equipped, and there were 10 of them, and Joel stood at the gate and looked at their faces and felt something that he did not allow himself to fully identify. He briefed them at the gate. He gave them what he knew of the interior topography. He described the transect routes his team had used. He told them about the clearing at the center. He told them, without dramatics and without softening, exactly what had happened during the survey, the 3 disappearances, the manner of each, the absence of sound or struggle or any visible cause. He told them about the sound from the canopy. He told them about the quality of the silence. Sergeant Barlow listened to all of this without expression. When Joel finished, Barlow asked, Do you have any hypothesis about what we might encounter? Joel looked at him. I have one, Joel said. But it is not the kind of hypothesis that will appear in any report I write. Barlow looked back at him with the even, considering gaze of a man who has heard many things and categorized them accordingly. Tell me anyway, Barlow said. Joel told him. Barlow listened. He nodded once when Joel finished, a single small nod that communicated not agreement exactly but receipt, the acknowledgement of information that had been registered. Then he turned to his team and said, "We go in together." Nobody moves more than 3 feet from the person beside them. Any officer who feels an impulse to move away from the group reports it immediately over the radio before acting on it. That is an order, not a suggestion. The team acknowledged. Joel saw a few of the officers exchange glances. He did not blame them. Barlow unlocked the gate. It swung open. The entrance to the forest was 40 yards ahead, the gap in the trees perfectly dark even in the early morning light, the moss floor visible just inside the tree line. They walked toward it. Chapter 12. Inside, again the forest received them the way it always received people. Silently. Without acknowledgement. The temperature dropped 4 or 5 degrees the moment they crossed the tree line, which was normal for old-growth forest, where the canopy blocked solar radiation, and the ground held the cold of the previous night. The light changed, going from the open gold of the early morning pasture to the diffuse gray-green of the interior, and the sounds of the outside world, the birdsong in the pasture grass, the distant sound of the county road, the first trucks of the morning, cut off with a suddenness that was more absolute than any natural boundary Joel had ever crossed. He led them along the northern transect route, the same route he had taken with Owen on the morning of the survey. He pointed out the positions where each disappearance had occurred without stopping. He noted, and the team noted, that there were no signs of the previous search team's passage. The moss was unbroken. There were no footprints. This was not right. Dozens of people had walked this ground over 4 days of searching, and the moss should have shown it, compressed and darkened in the high traffic areas, bent at the edges of boot prints. It showed nothing. Officer Corrigan noted this on the radio. Barlow acknowledged it without comment, and they continued. The forest was very quiet. Joel had expected this. He had spent 4 weeks with the forest's particular quality of silence in his memory, and standing inside it again, he found that his memory had been accurate. It was not the silence of the absence of sound. It was the silence of the presence of something that was not sound, something that occupied the same frequency as sound and displaced it. He was watching the canopy from the moment they entered. He had decided, during the 4 weeks of preparation, that this time he would look. He had thought about this decision carefully, and had concluded that whatever advantage not looking had given him the first time was situational, dependent on the need to function under immediate pressure, and that this time the operational value of knowing what was up there outweighed the cost of seeing it. He had made this decision in his home office in the middle of the day, with the ordinary sounds of his neighborhood coming through the window, and it had seemed like a rational decision. Standing inside the forest, looking up at the canopy, it felt considerably less rational. But he kept looking. They reached the first disappearance point, where Owen had been walking 6 feet behind him, and Joel stopped the team and marked the position on his GPS and described the circumstances again for the body cameras. The forest around them was unchanged from how it always was. The moss was deep and green and unbroken. The light came down in thin blades between the canopy branches 100 feet above. Joel was looking at the canopy when he saw it for the first time. This time it was more than a glimpse. The creature lay across the upper branches with the balance of something utterly at home there. Its torso looked narrow until it shifted and revealed the packed strength in its shoulders and limbs. Where the skin showed, it had the drained color of old wood kept too long from sunlight. It did not seem hurried or hungry. It seemed attentive. Its face was the part Joel's mind resisted most, not because it was grotesque in a simple way, but because it felt almost human in all the wrong measurements. The eyes caught hardly any light and yet seemed aware of everything. When it tilted its head, Joel had the awful impression that it was studying them rather than stalking them. Then it made a tiny sound, almost like a person swallowing before speech, and Officer Vance flinched so hard that Joel knew he had heard it too. He had expected something large. He had known from the displacement of air he had heard and felt that it was large. But the mind, when it uses the word large, applies the scale of things it knows. And what Joel saw in the canopy was outside the scale of things he knew, outside the scale of any living thing he had knowledge of, and his mind needed several full seconds to accept what his eyes were presenting to it. It was in the upper branches, which were 100 feet above the forest floor, and it was among them rather than below them or above them. It occupied the space between the crowns of 3 adjacent trees the way a person might occupy the space between 3 chairs placed in a triangle, resting among them, its weight distributed across the branches, which bent under it in a way that enormous branches did not bend under birds or squirrels or any animal Joel had a name for. It was still, completely still in the way that large predatory animals are still when they are not moving, with the absolute economy of motion of something that burns very little energy at rest and knows it does not need to burn more. It was watching them. He could not make out its features clearly at 100 feet. He could see its size. He could see the particular relationship it had with the branches, the way it was positioned among them with a familiarity that suggested it had been among them for a very long time, long enough that the branches had grown partially around its resting points in the way that trees grow around things that have been in contact with them for years. He could see the color of it, which was the gray-green color of the forest itself, of old bark and old moss, and he understood why it was so difficult to see from below even when it was not trying to be invisible. He understood, looking at it, that it was not trying to be invisible. It simply did not need to be. He put his hand on Barlow's arm. His voice came out steady because he made it come out steady. "Do not look up," Joel said quietly. "Keep moving, stay together. Move toward the tree line." Barlow looked at his face. Whatever he saw there was enough. He did not ask questions. He gave the order to move. Chapter 13. What the forest does they moved. Joel kept his eyes forward and his pace measured and led them back along the transect toward the tree line at the same just below running pace he had used to lead Priya and Danny out 4 weeks earlier. The sound from the canopy began when they were approximately a quarter mile from the tree line. It was the same sound, low, rhythmic, patient. The sound of something very large shifting its weight among the upper branches, moving in the direction they were moving, tracking them from above with the easy, unhurried confidence of something that has no reason to rush because it is operating in terrain it owns entirely, and its quarry has nowhere to go that it cannot follow. Now that they were listening for it, they heard layers inside it, a deeper shifting of weight, a light scrape against bark, the whisper of smaller branches brushing along a passing body. It sounded less like clumsy movement and more like a creature making many tiny corrections while staying almost directly above them. That precision was worse than noise. It meant control. Then, somewhere high to their left, a voice said Joel's name. It was not a shout. It was a careful attempt, shaped by something that had heard language but did not truly own it. Joel went cold from the spine outward. He did not answer. A few seconds later, the same broken voice tried Danny's name. Officer Maida whispered a prayer under his breath, and even Barlow's silence changed into something tighter and more afraid. Officer Vance heard it first and said, on the radio, "There is something in the canopy above us. It is moving parallel to our direction of travel." Barlow said, "Eyes forward. Keep moving." Officer Corrigan said, "It is directly above us now. I can see the branches moving." Barlow said, "Do not look up. Eyes forward." The sound moved ahead of them. This was the first change from what Joel had experienced before, and it was significant. Before, the sound had always been behind him or above him. Now it was moving ahead, tracking ahead of them, and Joel understood with the cold clarity of a man who has revised his assumptions based on new information that this was not the same behavior as before. Before, it had been taking individuals. Now it was doing something different. It was moving ahead of them. It was moving toward the tree line. It was going to be between them and the exit. That understanding passed through the group faster than speech. Fear changed shape at once. This was no longer the fear of being followed. This was the fear of being directed. Corrigan murmured over the radio that fresh bark had been torn from a trunk on their right, strips hanging loose at heights a person could never reach without a ladder. A few moments later, a hard sequence of knocks sounded ahead in the dark. 3 taps, a pause, then one more. No one mistook it for chance. Officer Maida said on the radio, in a voice that was professionally controlled but not fully controlled, "Something is at the tree line. Something is standing at the tree line." Barlow said, "Formation. Close it up. Nobody separates." Joel heard the team close in around him and felt the physical proximity of 10 people moving together, and he kept walking forward and did not look up, and did not look to the sides and watch the tree line, which was now visible through the trunks. A pale line of gray morning light 200 yards ahead. The sound stopped. The silence that followed it was the most complete silence Joel had ever experienced. It was not the forest's ordinary silence. It was the silence of something very large holding itself perfectly still and waiting. And waiting was something this thing knew how to do with a completeness and a patience that was, in its own way, the most terrifying thing about it. Nobody moved for 10 seconds. Then Officer Reyes, who was on the far right of the formation, said very quietly, "It is not at the tree line anymore." Nobody asked where it was. Nobody asked because in the same moment that Reyes spoke, the sound began again, and it was not from the canopy this time, and it was not from the tree line. It was from all around them, from every direction simultaneously, the slow, rhythmic sound of something enormous moving through the upper forest in a circle that had them at its center, and it was patient and it was close, and it was in no hurry at all. Barlow said, "Run." The word broke the last of their control. Boots tore through leaf mold. The line collapsed and reformed around raw instinct, each person trying to stay close enough to another body not to feel alone. Joel ran with the sick conviction that the darkness above was spilling downward with them. Branches thrashed. Something moved through the treetops in bursts so fast it seemed to vanish and appear rather than travel. Someone screamed behind him. He never learned who. The sound ended so abruptly that the silence after it felt like a second scream. Radio static burst through the air, followed by one breathless half-sentence and then only hiss. Panic became larger than thought. It drove Joel's legs, flattened his breathing into rough animal sounds, and reduced the world to roots, trunks, and the need to keep moving. For one instant he looked back. He saw only part of it, a pale face turning, one long arm striking a trunk to redirect its descent, the rest of the body unfolding through layers of shadow without ever truly falling. Then, undergrowth closed again and the sight was gone. Ahead, the air changed. The tree line was near. Around him came the panic of the others in fragments, a curse, a plea, the slap of a hand against bark to stay upright, while above all of it the creature pursued them with dreadful steadiness, never frantic, never unsure, perfectly at home in their terror. Chapter 14. What came after Joel Carn ran. He ran as he had run the first time, with the tree line ahead, and the open pasture beyond it, and the gate and the vehicles and the ordinary world on the other side. He ran with the compass bearing in his mind and the sound of the team around him, and the sound from the forest above and behind and to both sides, circling, closing. He was aware of the team for the first 200 yards. He was aware of Barlow on his left and Corrigan on his right, and the sound of boots on the moss all around him. At some point during the run, the sound of boots changed. He could not identify the exact moment. It was not a single event, but an accumulation, the way a sound diminishes by degrees rather than stopping abruptly. And he was running, and his own breathing was loud in his ears, and the sound from the canopy was loud, and his entire attention was on the pale line of light ahead of him. He was aware that the sound of running beside him was changing. He was aware of it the way you are aware of a piece of music that is losing instruments one by one, the melody continuing but thinning, the silence between the notes growing wider. He reached the tree line alone. He crossed out of the forest and into the open pasture, and the morning light hit him, and he stumbled and caught himself and ran 3 more steps, and then stopped and turned around. The forest was behind him, the tree line, the gap in the trees where the entry path was. Beyond it, the interior, dark and silent and perfectly still. He stood in the dew-wet grass with the morning sun on his face and looked at the forest and breathed. He was alone. He counted himself. 1. He had entered with 11 people counting himself. He was alone. He stood there for a very long time. He could hear the forest. He could hear its particular silence from 20 yards away, standing in the open air with the sun on him and the pasture grass around him. He could hear the silence the way you hear a frequency that is just outside the range of ordinary hearing, felt rather than perceived, present in the body before it arrives in the mind. He turned around and walked to the gate. He called the emergency line again. He sat on the hood of his truck and waited for them to come, and he did not look back at the forest. Part 4. Afterward, Chapter 15. The investigation that followed was unlike any investigation that Aldenmore County had conducted in its history. And Aldenmore County was not a young place. It was a county with 200 years of records, with a courthouse full of documents and a sheriff's department that had handled everything from ordinary rural crime to the occasional disappearance of hikers in the hill country to the east. None of those records prepared it for 11 officers who entered a forest in the morning and did not come back. Joel gave his account for the 3rd time. He gave it to county investigators, and then to state investigators, and then to 2 men from a federal agency who arrived in a plain vehicle and wore plain clothes and asked their questions in the flat, precise manner of people trained to extract information from accounts that did not fit ordinary categories. Joel gave the same account to all of them. He did not embellish it and he did not minimize it, and he answered every question as completely as his knowledge allowed. The body camera footage from the officers recovered nothing useful. All 10 cameras had been functioning when the team entered the forest. The footage from the first 40 minutes of the entry showed exactly what Joel had described: the forest interior, the team moving in formation, the ordinary landmarks of trees and moss, and the diffuse gray-green light. At some point during the entry, all 10 cameras developed the same anomaly simultaneously. A static disruption, not the total signal loss that camera failure would produce, but a specific kind of visual interference. A fine gray grain over the image, the kind of disruption that suggested something operating in the electromagnetic range was interfering with the camera's sensors. The anomaly appeared, and the footage from the point of the anomaly onward was unviewable. The investigators noted this in their reports. They noted it without explanation because they did not have one. Joel was asked, during one of the federal interviews, whether he could describe what he had seen in the canopy. He described it. The interviewer listened without expression and wrote things in a notebook and asked clarifying questions about size and color and the characteristics of its movement. Joel answered each question. The interviewer thanked him and closed the notebook, and that portion of the conversation did not appear in the summary document that Joel was shown several weeks later. He noted its absence without surprise. Chapter 16. The closure 6 weeks after the second entry. The Harrow Wood parcel and the surrounding land for a radius of 3 miles was designated a restricted zone under authority of a federal land management act that Joel looked up later and found to be an act that had been amended several times over the years, and that contained, in its most recent amendment, provisions for the restriction of access to land areas presenting unspecified hazards to public safety. The restriction was not publicized in the way that public land closures were usually publicized. There was no press release. There was no notice in the county newspaper. The unpaved road that led to the property was blocked at its entrance with a locked metal barrier, and the barrier was accompanied by a single sign that said Federal Land Management Restricted Zone and gave a phone number, and said that unauthorized entry was subject to federal prosecution. The timber company that had originally contracted the survey lost the contract when the land designation made the parcel inaccessible, and their lawyers made some inquiries about compensation. And the inquiries went nowhere in the particular way that inquiries sometimes go nowhere when the people receiving them have both the authority and the motivation to make them go nowhere. The families of the missing, of Owen Briggs and Claire Osborne and Marcus Tull, and the 10 officers, were told that the investigation was ongoing. This was technically true. It continued to be technically true for the years that followed. The case files were extensive. They contained interview transcripts and search reports and camera footage analyses and geological surveys and aerial photography and a great deal of other material. They did not contain conclusions. They did not arrive anywhere. They existed in a state of permanent, officially sanctioned inconclusiveness. Joel received a letter from the federal agency, approximately 3 months after the second entry, that thanked him for his cooperation and informed him that his consultation obligation had been fulfilled and that he should contact the enclosed number if he recalled any additional information relevant to the investigation. He filed the letter in a folder and put the folder in a drawer. He did not call the number. He had not recalled anything additional. He had recalled everything perfectly. He recalled it every night. Chapter 17. Joel. Much later he left the survey company. He could not go back into the field, not because the field frightened him. He had gone back into forests and done the work for a year after the events, and had found them to be ordinary forests, the kind that rustled and moved and held small animals and responded to footsteps in the normal way of living places. And the ordinariness of them had been both a relief and a grief, because it made the distinction between all other forests and the Harrow Wood more precise rather than less. He left because he could not look at a topographic printout of an old-growth parcel without seeing the satellite image of the Harrow Wood, the unbroken green canopy, and the pale oval of the central clearing. He could not walk under a dense canopy without listening for the sound. He could not stand at the edge of a forest at dawn without experiencing, for a few seconds, the particular quality of attention that the Harrow Wood had turned on them, that pressure at the periphery of awareness, that slight shift in the weight of the surrounding air. He stayed in his profession, but moved to design work. He sat at a desk and produced drawings of things that other people would build. And the buildings were good because he was a good architect. And the desk was in an office with windows that looked out onto an ordinary suburban street. And the street had trees on both sides of it that were small trees, planted by the city, spaced at regular intervals, their roots in concrete beds, their canopies thin and light and perfectly legible from below. He went to therapy for 2 years. The therapist was skilled and the work was real, and it helped in the ways that therapy helps, which are genuine and significant ways. And at the end of 2 years, Joel was sleeping without the forest in every dream and was eating regularly and was present in his daily life in a way he had not been in the months immediately following. But he kept the topographic printouts. He kept them in the drawer with the federal agency's letter, and sometimes, not often, once every several months or so, he took them out and laid them on his desk and looked at them. He looked at the contour lines indicating the gentle slopes of the forest interior. He looked at the symbol marking the central clearing. He looked at the coordinates in the corner that could, if entered into a mapping application, resolve to a satellite view of that unbroken green canopy and the pale oval at its center. He never entered the coordinates. He thought about what lived in the Harrow Wood. He thought about it the way you think about a fact that you cannot change and cannot unknow, and that exists permanently in your understanding of what the world contains. He thought about its patience, and its size and the way it had been among the upper branches of those trees as though it had been there for longer than the trees had been there, or as long as the trees had been there, or had in some way grown there alongside them, and was as much a part of the Harrow Wood as the trees themselves. He thought about what the forest had been before the survey company arrived at its gate with a padlock key and a topographic printout, and 6 people who did not know what they were walking into. He thought about what the forest would be long after the restricted zone signs rusted through and fell, and the metal barriers were eventually removed or eventually absorbed by the growth of the pasture grass, and the long, slow reclamation of open land by the forest's edge. He thought about what it had been doing in the Harrow Wood for all those years before anyone came. He thought it had probably been waiting, not for them specifically. Not for the survey team or the police officers or anyone in particular. Waiting the way very old things wait, without impatience, without urgency, without any particular investment in what arrived. Simply occupying its territory and being present, and being what it was and persisting. He thought about Owen, 26 years old, walking 6 feet behind him in the early morning forest light with the alert and open expression of someone for whom the world was still mostly new. He thought, I am sorry. He thought this more often than he thought anything else about the entire sequence of events. He thought, I am sorry I brought you there. He thought, I did not know. He thought, knowing would not have helped because I would have been sent anyway, and I would have sent you anyway because I was professional and thorough and believed in doing the job correctly, and none of those things turned out to be sufficient for the Harrow Wood. He thought, it does not matter what I knew or did not know. It was always going to take what it took. He thought, that might be the worst part. Chapter 18. The unpaved road that led to the Harrow Wood parcel was visible from the county highway for some years after the restriction was imposed. Anyone driving the highway between Aldenmore and the feed depot could see it. On the left, barely wider than a single vehicle, running between two walls of tall grass toward the tree line in the distance. Most people who drove that stretch of highway never noticed it. Some people noticed the sign at the entrance to the road. Federal Land Management Restricted Zone. They slowed as they passed it, registered it, and then drove on, their attention returning to the road ahead and the music on the radio and the ordinary events of their ordinary days. A few people stopped. Curious people. People for whom a sign saying restricted zone was an invitation rather than a deterrent. People who had not heard the stories, or who had heard them and did not believe them, or who believed them, but thought that believing them and experiencing them were different categories of activity that would not overlap in their particular case. A few of these people got out of their vehicles and walked to the barrier and looked down the road toward the tree line. What they saw was a road, two walls of tall grass, a tree line in the distance, an ordinary afternoon sky above it. What some of them reported feeling later to people they trusted was something less ordinary, a sense of being looked at from the tree line, a pressure at the periphery of awareness, a slight and inexplicable heaviness in the air despite the open sky and the sunshine and the distance between themselves and the forest. Most of them got back in their cars and drove away. The barrier held. The sign remained. The Harrow Wood sat at the end of its road behind its rusted gate and existed in its particular quality of existence, which was patient and very old and entirely indifferent to the passage of time or the attention of the world outside its tree line. It had been there before the road and before the gate, and before the county that contained it had a name. It would be there after all of those things had ceased to be relevant. It had what it had. It would have what came next. It did not need anything else. Epilogue: there is a record, filed in the archives of Aldenmore County, dated approximately 14 months after the events described in this account. It is not a long record. It is a single page, and most of its content has been redacted by the federal agency whose letterhead appears at the top. What remains visible, beneath the black bars of the redaction, is a date, a case number, and a single sentence in the summary field at the bottom of the page. The sentence reads, "No further action recommended at this time." Below it, in smaller text, is a secondary note that was apparently added later by a different hand in different ink. This note has not been redacted, perhaps through oversight, perhaps because whoever reviewed the document judged it insufficiently significant to conceal. The note reads, "Area remains undisturbed. Activity patterns consistent with previous observations. No indication of behavioral change. Recommend continued monitoring only." That is all the record says. It is, in its particular bureaucratic and bloodless way, the most frightening sentence Joel Karn had ever read. He read it because a source at the county had sent him a copy, having obtained it through means Joel did not ask about and did not want to know. He read it sitting at his desk with the ordinary suburban street outside his window and the small city trees with their thin canopies. And he read the words "continued monitoring only," and he sat for a long time with those words. Continued monitoring, which meant someone was watching, which meant there was something to watch, which meant it was still there in the Harrow Wood, among its enormous gray trees and its deep moss and its diffuse gray-green light, occupying the upper branches with the familiarity of something that has been in one place long enough for the branches to have grown around it, patient and present and unchanged. Waiting, as it had always waited, as it would wait still. Joel put the document in the drawer with the topographic printouts and the federal agency's letter. He closed the drawer. He sat for a moment with his hands flat on the desk surface and looked at the wall in front of him. Then he got up and went to the window and stood looking out at the street for a long time, at the small, ordinary trees with their thin canopies and their roots in their concrete beds, and the afternoon light coming through them in the normal way of light through trees that have nothing in them but branches and leaves and the ordinary small life of birds. Outside, a child rode a bicycle past on the pavement, and a dog walked on a lead, and a car slowed at the crossing and then moved on. The world was ordinary and present and entirely itself. Joel breathed. He did not look up. The end.